morning, welcome to Oxfordshire. My name's Jason. I've just come back from cycling across the US. While I was out there, someone was asking me, how did you plan your route? So I thought I'd put up a quick video just explaining the process. So the route planning obviously is very much an individual thing. It depends on what you're trying to achieve from the trip. So that might be just sort of being in nature, it might be sightseeing, it might be covering a lot of mileage. It also depends on the location, so things like the terrain is going to affect your planning, the weather, those kind of things. But it's good to start to get some of these things clear in your mind, because that will just help you make more of your time out on the trip. Now for me, there were several things. A lot of it was about sightseeing, but I was also aware that being a little bit older, I didn't want to cover really big sort of 100-mile days, and I would need some good sleep. So I planned on not going to campgrounds every night, making a bit more use of hotels, spending a little less time in the saddle, because by doing that you're less exposed to the sun, the rain if it's really bad, saddle sores, though that can be quite limiting on trips. So by keeping the days in the saddle short, you're just able to continue that much easier. And so then that started me thinking about traveling fast and light and covering the same sort of distance but covering it in much less time. So you can of course follow some pre-made routes. Some of the best are from the American Adventure Cycling Association, so worth looking at those if you want pre-made routes. They do a whole selection of maps you can follow, paper maps, or they now do apps. But for me, there were things I wanted to do. I wanted to understand a little bit more about America as well, the Native Americans, about some of American history, that kind of thing. So I'd rather do my own route than rely on a pre-made route. And that really started by putting down into Google Maps some of these sort of key points I wanted to visit. Don't forget to select the bicycle function within Google Maps. And pretty soon you'll start to come up with a route, albeit that it's not broken down into sections or anything like that. But Google Maps is a good way to start that process. And once you start to drop some points in Google Maps, you'll start to see the sort of length of the route, the elevation, and you'll start to get a view of how long it's going to take. So that can result in needing to replan it because it's going to take too long. So once I got some points into Google Maps, the next thing for me was to look at where I could stop. Because I wasn't camping, more reliant on hotels, I need to make sure that there were stops in the right sort of place. So I started looking at things like booking.com, hotel.com, Airbnb, that sort of thing. Not necessarily booking anything, but just deciding where was the sort of place that I could stop where I stood a good chance of finding some accommodation. And that made it longer in places because I had to divert to find a hotel. But eventually I ended up with a full route in Google Maps. Whilst you're still in Google Maps, it's a good idea as well to have a think about where you're going to spend your rest days. You definitely will need some rest days. I tried to combine them with sort of places I wanted to visit, or if I needed to repair the bike, that became a rest day. Now, I wouldn't use that route directly. I've had some experience with Google Maps where it leads you onto main roads, down footpaths, that kind of thing. The classic bit of Google navigation here. This is what happens when Google navigation goes wrong. Oh! So really, for me, the best process was to use that as a starting point, then go down into a little bit more detail. And for this trip, I used Komoot. I was really impressed with Komoot. It's much better on route planning, so much better for sort of cycling routes. It also gives you a lot of detail on the terrain type. Being able to plan your route based on terrain type is really good if you're planning a mix of road and trails. There's going to be some days where you want some trail, something off the road, and there's going to be others where you just want a bit of tarmac. So to understand how much of your route is tarmac, how much is trail, is really good, and that's a real strong thing for Komoot.
Everything changes.
So while we're talking about route planning, one thing you can pretty much guarantee is that things are going to change. For me, it was a combination of a bike breakage, and also I got hit with really bad weather in the Great Plains. They were talking about tornadoes and 3-inch hailstones. So this meant obviously I had to change my route plan. So yeah, you can pretty much guarantee one way or another your route plan is going to change. And the weather in the US is so much more extreme than in the UK that it's likely to play a big part in your route planning. I used the route sections that I'd produced in Komoot and used an app called Epic Ride Weather, where you can point at a GPX file, give it a date and a time of day, and it will forecast the weather along your route. And that was really useful, as well as there's quite a lot of wind and rain radar apps available. So it's always worth keeping an eye on that stuff, because it means you can get your ride done early if the weather's coming in later, or take a half day if it's wet or a really windy start. So yeah, planning around the weather in the US in particular makes a lot of sense. They have some big weather out there. I ended up with a bit of a routine where at the end of each ride I would check the weather for the next day and really not make any plans for the next day until I checked the weather. I'd probably try and get to a bike shop if I could and talk through with the guys in the bike shop the route I was planning and whether there was something better. So even though I put a lot of effort into producing day-by-day rides in Komoot, almost every day I ended up changing the route to some degree, giving it a bit of a tweak. But actually having those routes there in the first place as a starting point was really, really good. Now on the navigation itself, I was planning to use my Garmin 1030, but yeah, plans change. I managed to lose it somehow on my first day out in the States. So I ended up getting a smaller Garmin and actually run Komoot on my phone. Now that was good in some ways because you got a big screen, you get a lot of information, but it's bad in others in that it uses a lot of battery. I ended up using power bank almost every day. The only way I found of sort of slightly economizing was you could turn the screen off between turns, and that saved a bit, so that made a difference. And the other thing I used was good old-fashioned paper maps. Could see what was coming up in terms of elevation. It was useful just to have that paper map, and it was always in front of me on my bag, so I kept glancing down on it. One other thing, if you're navigating on the phone, then you need to make sure the right maps are on the phone. And I use Google Maps a little bit around town to get from point to point. So to make sure I got the right maps, I bought a pretty cheap eSIM for the phone, which did a good job of just making sure all those maps were up to date. So I think that's probably everything I wanted to mention on route planning. I hope you found something useful from it, or at least enjoyed that lovely Oxfordshire countryside. See you on the next video.